Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you all. Welcome to our attempt to create a kind of informal hangout with our distinguished guest. Before I introduce her, let me explain who I am, because there are a few of you I haven't met before. My name is Ed Finn, and I'm the director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. Um, and I will talk a bit more about that. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge and pay respects to the Akimel O'odham, Yavapai, Pipash, and other indigenous nations and peoples that have inhabited this land that we're on in Arizona for centuries. Their care, keeping, and imagination of these lands allow us to be here today. And so we're very thankful that we get to share some space and some time with all of you and with Adrienne Maree Brown. The Center for Science and the Imagination has a mission of inspiring collective imagination for better futures. And I discovered Adrienne's work through Emergent strategy and realized that this was somebody who was thinking about a lot of the same things that we think about, imagination as an invitation, as something that we do together, and that imagination and science fiction and stories that we tell about the future are a kind of toolkit, a set of practices that we use to make the world and try to make the world a better place. And so I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing your thoughts about all of that today, Adrienne. I'm so grateful that we get to spend a little time with you as part of in this sort of smaller group setting. And thankful to all of you for coming to hang out with us as well. So Adrienne Maree Brown is the writer in residence at the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute and author of We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and the co-editor of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements and How to Get Stupid White Men Out of Office. She is the co-host of How to Survive the End of the World and Octavia's Parables podcasts. Adrienne is rooted in Detroit. And so as part of one boat in the flotilla of different groups and entities at ASU that is like coming out of the Zoom space harbor and welcoming you across this dark sea of tiny rectangles. Thank you so much for joining us today, Adrienne.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you, and thank you all again. So I want to start with that little comment I made at the beginning, and I'm happy to tell you more about stuff that we do at CSI. But I just love to hear you reflect a little bit on imagination and science fiction as tools to change the world. I've got like more of your books keep piling up around my house, and so it makes me very happy and I feel like there's a lot of complementarity in the way that from my perception from having read some of your work in terms of how you're thinking about some of these issues and what you're doing. But yeah, what does imagination mean to you? Maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I deeply believe that there's a connection between the world as we see it and what was imagined, right? Like that everything we are living inside of and things we take for granted and constructs around race and gender and all of these things were imagined. Someone imagined them. And that imagination can be a really beautiful, positive thing, imagining community, imagining innovations, imagining going to space, imagining, um, you know, traveling in certain ways, imagining um, community that is diverse, that is multidimensional, and then there can be imagination that is not so beautiful. I think the imagination of superiority, is a lot of why we're in the circumstances we're in. Is that there's some people who imagined like, well, what if I was superior to everyone else? And hijinks ensue for centuries. So I think imagination is this fundamental piece of how the world gets shaped. And then we're in an interesting moment where it's very easy to dismiss imagination as being so important. Like it's like, oh, imagination, that's for the movies, that's for entertainment, and not acknowledging, one of the examples I often use is that We currently, right now, today, live in a world where a police officer can shoot an unarmed young Black person and then in court can defend themselves because they can say, in my imagination, I was in danger. Like, I'm like, that's serious. Like, imagination is actually a really, really serious thing. So if it's that serious, how do we take it that seriously? How do we hone it as a muscle? How do we work it? How do we practice it? And a lot of the work that I've been engaged in has been trying to come at it from a lot of different angles, like how do we imagine, like straight up, how do we do visionary fiction and radical imagination work?
Oh, that's what
How
I
do we
want.
imagine ourselves as nature? How do we imagine our pleasure being something we all have access to? And right now, it's how do we imagine abolition? How do we imagine ourselves practicing abolition? So, um, yeah, it feels like a fundamental piece to me of what needs to happen in the world.
So much of what you just said that resonates with things we've been talking about and doing, trying to do in our little corner of the world.
Yeah.
And, I think that idea, imagination is so powerful, and we all spend so much energy imagining things, and often imagining things that we didn't really choose, because it takes a huge amount of energy to imagine and give power to these structures that can be so oppressive and destructive. You know,
Yeah.
that we all collectively are doing this work, right? And we have to, we I think so much of the imagination work that we do collectively is invisible and unacknowledged, and
Yes.
we're sort of ruled by it instead of finding ways to take more charge and be, feel a sense of agency and responsibility and empower our own imaginations and try to imagine things for the better instead of being ruled
Right.
by fears and anxieties. Um, so a few paths I want to go down here, but one of them is you mentioned radical imagination. You
Hmm.
mentioned science fiction. Octavia Butler is sort of a, like in the background here. She's in the air. Could you talk a little bit about how storytelling is a part of this, and maybe and I want to get to sort of methods and practices more generally. So if there's some other
Yeah. Yeah.
you want to bring in, that would be great too.
Um, yeah. I mean, I, I I still thrill every time I hear her name. Like I have such a deep, like scholarly love ship of Octavia. And I think one of the things she taught us about storytelling is it's both the most ancient collective practice we have, right? Is that we, as soon as we came into community, it started to be like, oh, what is the story of all that exists? What is our story of the sun and the moon and the stars and the cycles of life? And those stories were so important that we built our religions around them, whole divinity practices around them that get uplifted today. It's like, is this truth? Is this myth? I don't know, but this is the story. These are all the stories of how we got here, and then there's the story of what's to come, and who gets to write the story. And so much of the work that I've been up to is trying to give more people permission to see themselves as everyone's holding part of the story, which is interesting. It's an interesting challenge as a writer, because as a writer, I'm like, I go off into the woods and I write a story by myself that occurs just to me. And I try to return to the world and be like, story is something original. And it's not that it's not original, but it's concurrently original, and there's nothing new under the sun, as Octavia said. Like, the stories have been told, and we tend to tell the same stories over and over. Um, I have been in a practice, and we'll see if I can achieve this in my lifetime, but I'm practicing that most of our stories are built around a core conflict. So it's like, you know, we were living and then this thing happened to us and we had to fight back against it. And there was a hero, and then, like, but the conflict is at the center. And I've been like, what would it look like to displace conflict from the center of the story and have pleasure be at the center of the story, or awakening, like an awakening that wasn't sparked by harm or fear or danger, but an awakening that was sparked by an invitation. And so I keep trying to figure out, like, at a very small scale, like how do we change how we think of story and how we build story. And then, you spoke to this, but in the wake of Octavia's Brood coming out, which was the book that I put out with Walida Imarisha, we did, yes, that one. I was like, I know it's in your house, Ed. Um, you know, but we went and did this tour where we were just doing sci-fi writing workshops. And so we were doing collective storytelling processes. And it was so titillating to see how tender and vulnerable and excited people were to just be given permission to hold part of the story. To be like, I'm not just a character in someone else's story, which, for me, like as a Black person in the US, I'm like, my ancestors were brought here to be a character in someone else's story, a minor character, a nameless character, 3/5 of a character, not even a whole character. And and so to the act, I mean, it's such a sacred act to then be like, I am reclaiming that I, as much as anyone else, no more or no less, I have a story that is an important part of what comes. I also think the stories we imagine and like how many people we have at the table being like, we're telling the story together shapes what then comes. And I think about this a lot with disability justice. This is a big one where it's like, architecture is really creating a story of the future of a place, right? Like we have a story of a building and what's going to happen in this building and who's going to be here and how we're going to use it. But if disabled people aren't in the room when that story is being cast and collectively imagined, then we end up with a building that doesn't have any ramps or wide bathroom doors or anywhere for people to come sit or whatever. It's like, so I'm like, oh, we didn't have enough people together to ideate the story. And that becomes now what I'm in a constant practice of is how do we get enough people with enough divergent ways of being together to start to tell the story of what we want to come, that's not just it being in someone else's matrix, surviving in someone else's dream, right? I'm like, wake up. Let's wake ourselves up from the dream that did not include us in a significant way, and then begin to co-dream, co-imagine, co-build a story where not just we exist, but we can see that 7 generations, that indigenous worldview. Like we can really see our progeny, our babies, our and our earth. Like that's the other thing is this has been really humbling lately. That I'm like, oh, the earth has a story. The earth has a million stories too. In Iceland, the earth is telling a story of release right now. This massive volcano that's just like, I'm shaking everything up again. And I'm like, yeah, that volcano speaks for me. That volcano speaks for me. It's telling a story that I feel that volcano story. Um, so, I'm just like, oh, I want to partner with the stories of humans. I also want to be partnering. How do I partner with the stories of those who I may not, they didn't learn English, they didn't get colonized yet, but they also have stories to tell.
Again, so much that you said that really connects with me, and I think the things that we're all doing at CSI, that first of all, that sense of giving people permission and agency to talk about the future, and also to be hopeful and optimistic, right?
Yeah.
Which also, because there's so much fear and it's often scarier to put yourself out there and say, well, here's something that I think would be good, here's something we want to work towards. And that fundamental spirit of optimism is something else that has motivated us from the beginning. Not that it's all going to be great, and that everything's fine, or that some nice people in white lab coats or in Silicon Valley are going to fix it all. But that doing the work, imagining different futures and exploring the possibility space is how we start to get there, that we can make the future better by working on it, imagining it today. And I just to echo what you said, I think the major crisis we face right now as a species is that we're too few people are in charge of imagining the future or feel like they have permission to imagine the future. We have to get much more inclusive if we're going to survive, baseline goal, but to reach beyond that and to thrive and to create that beautiful world that we want. Um, and I guess I want to talk about joy and beauty and pleasure, but I want to first talk about the work, which I guess is also, they're connected. But so, maybe you could talk a little bit about methods. You use the word facilitation a lot.
Mhm.
That's sort of a core practice, I think. How do you inspire collective imagination? How do you do the
Mhm.
work?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's very fascinating for me is I've been leaning, so I've spent the last like basically 25 years facilitating social justice work. And by that meaning, my role was to hold space for change to happen, and um and really to try to make it easy. It's like being a human is hard. Being a human with another human or more is hard. Um, because our experiences are so divergent, like as a species. And it's one of the things that's the most interesting to me, like looking at the natural world, that, you know, sometimes I wonder, and again, this might be human arrogance, but I'm like, it seems like as a species, we have the most special diversity of experiences. That most species, if you look at it, you're like, oh, flamingos, you're a flamingo, you have a fairly common experience. Oak trees, this is your experience, but humans have wildly divergent experiences of like what it is to human. And so to facilitate is to be like, from wildly different experiences, how do we find a common thread? How can I make it easier to hear where there is alignment, and to turn and face the places where there is divergence and see if it can become generative rather than disruptive or the end of the road. And I love the method of facilitation. And um, I will admit, my confession is like, it just, that was what I was called to do. Like I didn't train, I didn't, no one told me that there was even a thing called this. It was just like, this is what I do when I show up in a space. And I think um, that in every 100 people or so, there's a handful who share that call or that impetus of like, oh, when I get into a group, I see the whole. When I get into a group, I see the pattern, you know? And so I think those people become teachers, become facilitators, become mediators, become leaders sometimes. I wish more of them became leaders and politicians and stuff like that, because I'm like, it's so rare that you see a facilitative politician, right? I think this is part of why Obama, as many critiques as I had of different policy pieces, he resonated with me because I was like, he's a facilitative leader, and you can see that in how he moves. So that method has been a major one for me, and I'm excited because today my next book just went up for pre-order today. It's called Holding Change: The Way of Emergent Strategy Facilitation and Mediation, and it's kind of like Dao De Ching is what I had in mind. I was like, how do I make these brief pieces of wisdom offerings of like, here's what I figured out about facilitation that I know works, or I know is true. I understand, it's like, you can hold this and work with this. Um, so that method has been really important to me. Facilitation as a method led me to the method of mediation, right? So that what kept happening is I would be holding a group, and then something would arise that was um, systemic pressures playing out as interpersonal dynamics. And so it'd be like, okay, what do we do with this? Because it's not just like this guy's an asshole and whatever. It's like he's embodying patriarchy in this moment and white supremacy, and she's embodying years of intergenerational trauma that makes her think that she can't speak up. And they're in this interaction where now she's found her voice, and he's not ready to hear it. That's what's actually happening. How do I hold a room for them to both be in their humanity with all the power dynamics and all the stuff that's going on? And so I developed a method that I call kitchen table mediation. So I was like, I need to be able to do this anywhere, because it's never planned. Now it's starting to be a little bit more planned, but at the time I was like, it's never planned. It's never like, we need help. It's always like we're in the meeting and it's grinding and everything is coming to a stop. So the mediation method came in there. And then the last piece for the ideation specifically was invitation. So I've been really honing the practice of like, how do I ask questions that generate um, not just one answer, but many answers? And then how do I let people know like many answers can coexist in a healthy ecosystem, right? This is the science of things. In a healthy ecosystem, the diversity, the biodiversity is how you know it's healthy, because so many different things are able to coexist and they're not expected to try to become one thing. So, I talk about this all the time with organizers because I'm like, y'all are trying to make everyone be an oak tree, but you need the oak trees and you need the mycelium and you need the sparrows and you need bees, but you also need flowers. And I was like, you have to be in a system where there can be symbiosis, where there can be dynamic relationship, and where when something's ready to die, that other things are ready to make life from that. Like you need all of that fecundity and that abundance. So for me, getting in a space and being like, yes and that theater practice, that improv theater, yes and yes and yes and how do you at least hold room for enough of that to unfold, that people can then be like, okay, from all this yes and here's something that thrills all of us. Because I think what has happened, especially amongst people who are like, we're the losers or we're not in the winning position, is that we brainstorm, but then we land on the lowest common denominator and the thing that's least likely to ruffle the feathers or actually perturb the surface. And but what we need is a thing that's going to like drain the pond, right? We need something that's like, we got to get this whole thing's got to go. So I'm like, how do we start to ideate enough that we find that idea that enlivens all of us, that makes all of us like, oh, that's it, and I can see my place in it. And in Detroit, we did these beautiful processes where we're like, what needs our imagination medicine here? What issues need the medicine of our imagination? And it was like, clearly the water crisis, clearly the heat and housing crisis. Every winter, homeless people are put out of their homes, but then they also shut off the heat for people who aren't paying those bills. You can't do that with how cold it gets here. Even as climate is changing, we still have at least 1 month of real cold. So stuff like that was like, so starting to ask communities, every community actually can answer this. If we were doing a workshop right now, and I was like, what do y'all, where do you know inside of your community that imagination is needed? You would have those answers. And that also helps. It's like every community knows, they know what they need. They know what they need. They may not know how to get it, what to shift in order to practice something new, but they have a sense of like, well, here's the problem. And if there's a problem, that's the invitation into imagination.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I think that idea of uh, cultivating, inviting people into imagining for themselves, right, rather
Yeah.
than just sort of pitching or selling a story that is the one size fits all or somebody else
Yeah.
came up with. I think that the most important work, but it's also really hard. And I love the way you talked about how important it is to hold space for everybody who has their own context and situations, and how so often we become microcosms of these much bigger forces, right? Often unwittingly, and we're already tired because we spent so much time, supporting that big castle floating in the air, right, with our own
Yes.
imaginations. Um, and I guess I think we we do some things like this, but we tend to do it in a smaller environments, and we have we're asking people to work together on coming up with some kind of a vision for the future.
Yay. I
And
love smaller environments.
yeah, but I think we've started to think about how we expand, and instead of bringing people to us, how we find communities where they are and help
Yes.
communities, start to um, imagine, or how we can help, how we can facilitate some of that work.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe I think you've talked about this a little bit, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this idea of resilience. I think about imagination as this kind of ignition system for all this other
Hmm.
stuff that we know we really care about, like
Yeah.
empathy and foresight
Yeah.
and resilience. But we don't see it. We don't see the imagination part of it. We just see the outputs or the symptoms when it goes missing. So is that I love the way you bring in complexity and emergence in emergent strategy. Is resilience a word that you think about a lot? Is that something, like the idea that it's
Yeah.
not just showing up and facilitating, but how do you create things that persist on their own?
Yeah, I think of resilience a lot, and in a lot of ways too. I will be honest. The first time I heard the term resilience, like applied to community, I was very wary of it because I was in Detroit, and it was like, y'all are so resilient, and I was like, it that the way that it's like, oh, you're so resilient, we can continue to abuse the community because you're fine. You'll bounce back, or you just somehow magic Negro, you always make it. I don't know. And that feeling of like, no, that's not what we mean. That's not what we want to cultivate in ourselves. Um, and I study somatics. I've studied somatics for the last 10 years. So in the body, resilience is that capacity to recover from harm. And imagination is one of the first things we do to recover from harm. It's one of the ways we know that recovery is happening, because we start to be like, oh, I'm not just stuck in the trauma story. The trauma story, at some level, the trauma story says I'm unlovable, right? Like fundamentally, if you root all the way down into almost every trauma story, some part of it says, I'm not lovable. And the imagination starts to say, I am lovable. Maybe I could love myself, perhaps. My community could love me, all the little things. And there could be a relationship of love between the people in a community, between the community and the earth. It could be a love that is wide enough to hold the fact that trauma was there, is there, right? That we live inside of that. And uh, when you're in a community that feels they cannot imagine, usually it's because the trauma is still present and still happening. So when you're, like we've been through a couple of rounds of this in Detroit now, where especially certain zip codes where they're being bombarded by so many multitudinous crises concurrently, that when you start to ask people, like, well, what do y'all want? We want this to stop. That's as far as we can think. We want this harm to stop. And I think that is happening right now on the largest scale that we have understand. I think the Me Too movement is like, we would like room to imagine, and we can't even get there because we just need a name, like that this harm is happening all the time and it's too much. And I think Black Lives Matter is from that place. Like, saying our lives matter is the minimum thing we should be imagining together. And we have to fight for that, right? So there's these places where it's like, how do we help people come to the place of, that trauma is there, and you have the right to imagine beyond it. And practicing strengthening that muscle, that is your resilience. That's how you will recover from this harm, is that you'll start to imagine a life beyond this harm, and put the harm in that rear view mirror, put the harm as a scar. And, I think about this on the grandest scale right now. One of my visions, my radical imagination, is that capitalism becomes a scar, not a present activity, that patriarchy becomes a scar, that we imagine cooperative economics, that we imagine right relationship with the planet, that we imagine um, consent based sensual culture, that we imagine these things that where it's like, we went through that as a species. We did go through that. It was hard. We nearly eliminated some of our people that we deeply needed. That was awful. And here's how we are imagining ourselves back into a species, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you know so much of what you're saying, it resonates. Again, I keep saying that over and over again. So,
Well, because we're doing that, I mean, like science and imagination, like we're floating in the water togetger, like, whoop,
yeah,
I
totally.
love you too. Like we're in there,
Right there. And I want to say, I'm going to ask you one more question, or one more clump,
Okay.
one tangled clump of like 4 questions. And then I
At
want,
least you're owning it. Own it.
no, that's kind of, it's a choose your own adventure kind of. So, but then I want to let everybody know that I see a couple of great questions in chat already, but start thinking about what you'd like to bring to the conversation. We can open this up. Responding to so many of the things you just said, yes, there's so many more ways we could imagine our lives, right? That
Yes.
aren't about these pyramid schemes and, living in a sort of an economy of wanting and needing and fearing and,
Yeah.
lacking, which is so much of the way that we've organized our world right now.
Mhm.
And I want to connect this to the future, because I think one of the other fundamental things we have to do is find that sense of joy and optimism and hope, right? And even this is, maybe a weird thing to say, but to sort of find the pleasure even in our scars, right? To say the things we've moved through,
Yes.
and connecting history in the future, the past and the future, as the only way we can escape the present. And one of the weird things that I see is that we've really made a kind of prison out of the present moment, and you can't
Yes.
escape either way.
Yes.
And that's one of the the powerful kinds of imagination that we need to foster, to kindle. So
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about sort of that idea of, and I don't know if pleasure, joy, optimism, hope, these aren't all the same, but how you think about that, because that, I think, is the only way we can really inspire broad change, is to show people it's something that they want, right? That it's
Hmm.
not something that you should do or that you have to do, but it's
Yeah.
something that we want because it's going to make us feel better.
Yeah. I like this. Yeah, I think there's components like the ideas weave around each other. The place where I keep coming back to, like the kind of irresistible place that keeps drawing me back, is this question of satisfiability. Like, what is it you long for, which is often rooted in where you feel unsatisfied currently, right? And what would it feel like to feel satisfaction? Do you know when it happens? And then what would it feel like to feel collective satisfaction? Which I'm always thinking at the fractal level. I'm like, if we don't have a pattern of individual satisfaction of any practice where we know, like, this is satisfying, that was enough, then I don't know how we would do that at a collective level. And I think we make this mistake often, is we're like, we need to defund the prisons. And I'm like, but you still punish everyone you get angry at. So we need to stop that punishment practice, so that, right, all that becomes a viable strategy. Because I'm like, don't defund the prison so that you can just keep punishing, that we free for all punish. I'm like, how do we unlearn the behavior at the root system? Or we need a functional democracy. I'm like, you have not shared a decision making process with anyone ever. Even in your family, you're constantly manipulating the game, or like someone's in control of the budget or whatever. How do we practice shared decision making, collaborating about budget, collaborating about resource? So, I think about pleasure that same way, that I'm like, well, if we have been trained to think that satisfaction is not even possible, then how do we first flip that switch on? That's like, I could be satisfied. And right now I'm like, I'm trying to accumulate days where I feel that satisfaction each day, inside of each day. And I feel the satisfaction inside of multiple relationships, right? And it means I have to be really mindful. Like, this is my current mindfulness practice, is that when it happens, I'm like, oh, yes, this is it. I was told what love would be like. I tried all these different experiments, but now I'm in love, and this is satisfying. I feel met. I was told I could never keep plants alive, but I taught myself how to be present with plants, and I got bulbs and globes, and I started singing to them, and now I'm in a room surrounded by plants. Like, that's very satisfying to me. And just noticing it at the scale of like, oh, this in this moment right now, this is enough. This is enough. And then letting whatever the next need is arise from that place. Like, oh, I'm actually really quite resourced, but now I'm hungry, right? Because it's also always changing. And I think it's like, how do we practice that at a community level, where it's like, I have never felt community satisfied by our justice process, ever. because we either have the option of there were no charges and there's no accountability, or this person's going to prison, which we know doesn't work. And we have 250 years of that experiment failing and not ending harm. So there's no satisfying option inside of the current justice scenario. And so for me, that's where I'm like, I want to learn how we bring that sense, that felt sense of satisfaction to each of these things. And I said something recently. I was on this podcast called Politically Reactive. And I was like, I don't want a fake orgasm of a climate policy. And it keeps coming back to me that I'm like, that's what I'm talking about. This is what I'm saying. It's like, it ties together. I don't want the fake orgasm version of all these justice things that actually need to be real. Like, we really need to have the total surrender, total presence, total yes, so that we can move forward in life and be in an authentic relationship with the world. And and then I think, who benefits from the fake orgasm? Who benefits from the dissatisfaction, the unspoken dissatisfaction? The current systems that exist, right? They're so terrified of the wound that'll come from not being, like if you tell them, oh, yeah, I faked that orgasm, then it's a wound to their system. Oh, what's wrong with my penis or whatever happens inside? It's like, oh, it's not about wounding your ego. It's about, we need to collaborate together. We need to communicate together. We need to be more present. So much needs to happen so that we can both be here in that. So that is also the piece where I'm interested about the scarification, because I think the idea needs to become a scar, but all the people who are participating in it, they're also the wounded. People who think that they are supreme because they are white, they are trying to avoid the wound of not being supreme. That they're like, that's gonna hurt so much. It's like, it's actually okay. It's so I've lived my whole life not thinking I was supreme to anyone, and I'm fine. It's good. I'm satisfied. My life feels great because I'm not trying to uphold a myth. I'm not trying to like sustain a lie and puff myself out and project something that's not true. I'm just like, no, I'm a human being. I'm good at some stuff. I can't speak any languages. I'm a human. It's fine. So I feel like there's that piece of like, it's like we kind of have to, I'm trying to think of the metaphor for it. You know, it's like, how do we actually pull the toxin out of the wound so that it can scar? Maybe that's it. It's like all these participants are like, I'm like, by participating, you're the toxic little thing in there. You had to pull that out. And Octavia has this brilliant thing in Lilith's Brood where cancer is the thing that these aliens are interested in. These aliens come to Earth and they gather stuff from different species, and they're like, the most valuable thing humans have is cancer. When I first read this, I had a friend dying from cancer, so I was like, fuck, Octavia, fucking with me, like. But I was like, there's something so brilliant about even things we think of as toxic are mostly just in the wrong place.
Mhm.
They're not where they can actually serve. They're not where they can be in their light. So I'm like, I'm curious, what would it look like for white men to be in their light, right? What would it look like for racists? Like, I'm like, what is there a light in there? Like, what is it? Is there some deep longing for belonging that, like what's in there? And I think all of it is like, if you let that scar, you could actually belong. And belonging, I think, is like one of the most fundamental things that all humans want. Um, and so we're trying, I said this to the group earlier, but I'm really in this exploration right now of like belonging as it relates to identity versus community, and how we keep collapsing those. So we're like, oh, my identity is my community. And I'm like, no, your identity is your identity. And community is a chosen place where you work with people to co-create belonging. And I think this is what, I think if you look at the majority of people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, it's people who've mistaken and collapsed identity and community looking for belonging. And now they're just in jail because, or whatever. So it's like, oh, that didn't work, but, will they adapt? So.
Yeah, I think that's something we're really wrestling with, is how to be together,
Yeah.
be individuals together and disagree about some things, but have, honest communication. And,
Yeah.
The internet does not seem to have helped. But I just want to say, I think sometimes, I just echo you again, saying this is enough is the most radical thing you can say sometimes, right? Finding the way to be satisfied. And I think
But it
that's,
has to really be enough.
Yeah, right. That's right. It's not about just
Yeah.
uh,
I
not.
was like, I learned that, from my mom, that I was like, you said that, but you didn't mean it. And I can sense your resentment, and that resentment is not, that's not enough. I was like, mhm.
Yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that's right. But to find the way to, identify the things that are enough,
Yeah.
and own, like to own those and cherish those. Um, I want to pause here and open this up. So if you'd like to raise your hand, that would be great. I already have a couple of questions here. So maybe Justine, raise your hand, and then Lisa, we'll go to you next with your question that you would put in the chat.
Hello.
Please,
Hi,
if
Justine.
I didn't say this, please introduce yourself quickly, and then, go ahead.
Yeah. This is really wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for doing this. My name is Justine. I'm a graduate student at ASU in the Justice Studies program, but I'm also here with Mutual Aid Phoenix.
Yay.
And also representing a group that I worked with, Humanities Behind the Walls, where we taught classes at a women's prison here. And
Awesome.
I wanted to share with you, and I do have a question, very brief, that both Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and your book, Emergent Strategy, we read inside and deeply informed so much of what we did. We were able to do like a play with Vicky Law, do poetry readings,
That's
organize
great.
and it was wonderful. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, your work meant a lot to us too. So thank you. Sorry, I'm like, but
we're gonna do it together, honey. I'm just like, oh, yeah.
So I guess the question I have, and I think you kind of talked about this in all the questions that were asked, but I kind of want to try to bring it together a little bit, is that the role imagination plays in our movements.
Yeah.
Because I think there are multiple imaginations within our movements, and some lead us down one path, and some lead us down another.
That's right.
Paths are messy. So I'm wondering how you would think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we talked about with Octavia's Brood was all organizing is science fictional behavior. Like, we're trying to imagine a world we've never experienced, a world without prisons. One of the things is like we've never actually known that, but we feel in our hearts that it's possible. And I think what happens is, in some places, it's like we imagine, like if we need to imagine beyond the horizon, but we only imagine to the horizon. I think that's what happens sometimes. So it's like we're imagining. It's like, yes, we're trying to do justice work, whatever, but we don't actually imagine beyond the like imbalance of power. So those organizers end up in what I think of as the power over organizing model, where it's like these poor people in this community, they don't know anything. I'm going to come tell them things and convince them to care about, life, because they don't even know to care about life. And I'm going to organize them. Right. And so you see that, and it's well-intentioned, right? It's like, we got to free these people's minds, but when I've been in community, I've never been in a community where people are like cluelessly living, like, it's like, if people don't know, it's because they're under so many pressures. And what you need to do is not try to then become another pressure, trying to change their mind, but you need to relieve the pressure, right? Relieve some pressure. And so that's why I loved, I was referencing this with a friend the other day. Oh, I was talking about this with Toshi. We were talking about this on the Octavia's Parables podcast about the Black Panther Breakfast Program and how it relieves this pressure. And now, like, so many schools have breakfast program. It's like just an assumed thing in most schools now, that it was one of the reasons why COVID was so daunting for so many communities, because they're like, the breakfast program, it might be the most important thing that's happening for these kids in breakfast and lunch, regardless of what they're learning. So something like that, where it's like relieving the pressure of hunger in a community, then allows something different for the kids. It allows something different for the parents. It allows something different for the whole. And I think about how often we're not willing to do that humble work of relieving a pressure, because we're like, our ego is tied up in doing this ideological work of like, we've got to change the mind. And Detroit really humbled me around that. Because you try to come tell anybody in Detroit anything about me, to think they're like, get out of our faces. We don't even trust y'all organizers, like whatever. And meanwhile, all of them are organizers in the way that I would think, like I was trained in New York and California. I'm like, all the people making change in Detroit are folks I would think of as organizers. And they're like, this is just being in a community and being responsible for your community and caring about it. And that for me was a total like, whew, right? And the big lesson was, if people's trash is not getting picked up, focus on helping their trash get picked up. If people's heat is not on, focus on getting the heat turned on. If you attend to those material needs with community, they'll figure out the ideas, right? They will find, and then feed them books, right? Feed people books. Like that's why I write, because I'm like, okay, I can't reach everyone. I can't talk to everyone, but I I want to help people have a language for what they are doing. And emergent strategy is happening. It's been happening since the beginning of time. I didn't make it up. I saw it happening. And for communities to have a common language across different gender background, whatever, to be able to say, oh, like we're adapting together. I don't have to teach them to do that. It's already happening. It's just like, can you notice that this thing you're doing is valuable and you could be better at that thing if you valued it. So, yeah.
I see
Thanks
Lisa
for that
and
question.
Damien. Yeah, sorry, Justine, did I catch you
Yeah.
out? Okay.
And thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa K. Solomon, and I am a designer in residence futurist at the Stanford D School, where I spend a lot of time bridging futures thinking, design thinking, and starting really with humans and allowing them to be their best selves, to imagine their preferred collective futures. And I just want to say thank you so much. When I read your book, I just felt like I was home listening to you speak. I feel like I'm even more at home, and there's just something absolutely beautiful in how you present these ideas. And I appreciate you chatting with me. It was more of not even so much my question as opposed to playing back what I heard. And
Ah,
what I'm just resonating so much with is the intentional language that both you and Adrienne, you are using to get people into a place of leaning in versus leaning out. And you spoke of throughout your talk a lot of tensions of the past
yeah.
and the future, tensions of trauma and love. And I guess the biggest tension I see and would love, and I'm so excited for your new book, is this work requires people to slow down in order to speed up. And I wonder if
Mhm.
you could talk a little bit about how you get people. And listen, I'm calling in from the heart of Silicon Valley, like
Yeah.
whatever
I was like,
on it, the exponential, right? And I'm at the point, and I'm always like, can we just slow down, right? I
right.
promise you that going slow will help us go fast. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you invite people into a slower way of noticing, of using intentional language, of getting them to
Yeah.
join you for a journey that is emergent in and of its nature. Um,
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Um, I mean, one thing, in my ideal world, I would model that. It hasn't happened yet. I'm still very much, I'm trying all the time to be like, slow down, girl. Like, I'm slowing my life down. I am like, I'm trying to be an embodiment. I have a little tattoo of a turtle. I think it's over here somewhere. And I have a pet turtle now. And my turtle is a really helpful teacher. And we have an Instagram account for our turtle because every day I watch this turtle walk around and they just like move at exactly the pace that they move at. And when something scares them, they're like, let me stop. And I'm going to slowly take in all the information before I make a decision to do anything else. And it's such a good teacher for me. I'm so used to like, make the decision in midair, make the decision before you land, whatever it is. So at an individual level, I'm like, how do I slow down? And when I'm facilitating, or when I'm holding space in a room, if I can slow down, the room will slow down because that's what I'm embodying. That's what I'm inviting them to is like, let's take a breath together here. Let's notice that sometimes a lot of emotion will be popping up and you can feel an emotion pop up and get truncated. It's like because someone else jumps in. And so just pause, hold on. Wow. It feels like that person did you just apologize to this room for something that happened in here? I want to make sure we notice that, right? So slowing down at that level, like asking people to be there with you. And then when I'm talking to groups, trying to convince them to slow down, to like trust me, to let things move a little slower. The main thing I talk about is trust, right? That I'm like, you all say you want to trust each other. And I promise you, as a Virgo, I promise you, you will be more efficient if you trust each other. You will get so much more done if you trust each other. But you're going to have to slow down to get there. Just like in a romantic relationship, because all relationships are relationships, right? Like some of them have dynamics of sensuality or eros or forgiver, raising kids, but they're all relationships. Even in the work realm, they're relationships. So at the beginning, the trust is slow because you're literally strangers to each other. But the more you learn and understand, oh, this person has a whole tale that has nothing to do with me, that's their own sovereign experience, and I have my own sovereign experience, and what we're doing is dancing between those, then you learn like, oh, I can trust that this person is going to show up from their experience and I'm going to show up from mine. And as opposed to how we get, I think, socialized, which is don't trust until someone earns it. And the minute they do something, they're trying to harm you. Don't trust them, right? It's like, no, literally no one's thinking about you that much. You know, even when now, like the internet, if someone literally comes straight at me with harmful behavior on the internet, I understand that is not actually about me, right? If I can trust that that person has a wound, I can examine, do I have anything to do with that wound, right? Do I have anything to do with that wound? How can I trust that this dynamic is not what it appears to be necessarily? And that takes time and it's very slow at first. But then when you see groups who trust each other, whether it's a group of two or a family unit or an organization, it's mind blowing how quickly things can move. And Silicon Valley is a trick because people try to leap straight to the fast and often move very quickly because there's a fake trust, like a surface level trust, because it's like, I trust you to have smart ideas. Like smart people, once you recognize someone else is smart, you're like, I trust you to be smart with me. Like I've made that. I've done that before. I'm like, we could get a lot done. But I'm like, oh, wait, I didn't know you were also evil. I didn't know you were actually, or, capitalist or whatever it is. I'm like, actually, I didn't know there was this massive values difference. That means that you're using your intelligence differently than how I'm using it. And then you have a trust breakdown. And whether you can recover is like, are you willing to slow down and find values alignment, right? So when I talk to groups about trust, that's usually the moment where they're like, oh, like, and it'll help us work better. Now, I think something that has been helpful is, because there's like, you have the idea of it. I had the idea of this. I'd seen it work at small scales, with different organizations and formations. But now it's like, I was able to facilitate the movement for Black lives. And at a moment of crisis, get them to slow down, focus on trust, weave a much deeper web with each other. And now they're moving federal policy and they're launching off new organizations. And so much is happening that is tangible material outcome because they trust each other enough to allow everyone to play their position, right? And the same thing is happening with other very large formations that I got to support. And so I'm like, oh, I have case studies. I'm like, I got receipts. Like it really does work at it scales. And trust is something that's like the internet and trust are like in a big battle right now because the internet, everything is about moving fast and then faster. And it's not a place to slow down. So one of the things I've been really working with people on is like limit the amount of time you spend on the superhighway, right? Like it doesn't mean you can't be on there, but just really, really, think of it as you're moving through your life. If you sprint all day, you will not be able to go far. You won't be able to go very many days if you sprint all day. And the internet is sprinting, right? Your mind, your heart, everything, your sense of reactivity, everything's sprinting. So sprint for 15 minutes. Right now that's my cap, as I allow myself to sprint for 15 to 30 minutes a day. And then I'm off of there. And I'm like, I'm in a marathon over here. I'm on a stroll over here. I'm laying on the couch playing Mario Brothers. Different things are happening at different pace. But I know I will not survive and I will not have good ideas if I'm sprinting all day. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
I see Damien and Troy. I'm hoping we can get to both of their questions, so we might run a little bit past the hour just to
Okay,
everybody.
I'll talk shorter too.
But I'll, we're fine with that. And I think it should be okay for your schedule because we're hanging out with you a little bit after this too, Adrienne.
Oh yeah.
But just if anyone needs to drop off, of course, that's totally fine. So go ahead, Damien.
Hi, I want to first thank you so much for the talk today and your time. I really, really appreciate it. And I find myself, as previously stated, in deep agreement and feeling a sense of resonance throughout so much of what you talked about and what you write about in general, obviously. But so thank you for that. I'm Damien. I am a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. Cool. My work is in how values get embedded into technology. I focus on AI and human biotech interventions specifically.
So, I like all the ways those things sound. Yeah.
Yeah, they work together in weird ways, and Octavia Butler's work is obviously like embedded and crouched in all of those things. So I really do. I appreciate everything there. My question kind of gets back to something that you were talking about in terms of like values mismatch and that overarching kind of like, how do we use this kind of crux of what you're talking about in terms of imagination as a communicative language to help us bridge those values mismatches when they show up, right? So like so much of the work that we all do, whether we are policy individuals, whether we are writers, whether we are researchers, or whether we are all of the above, as many of us are, so much of that work is about trying to make legible these different needs, these different stakes, these different drives, and these different values, right? And so how do you, in your practice and also in your intentions and your understandings, see the work of using imagination to make those very, sometimes very wide gulfs, at the very least a little bit narrower, if not bridging them entirely?
Yeah, I like this question, Damien. And I think of imagination as a technology. I think of it as an indigenous technology, right? So when I was working at the Ruckus Society, I got to work with all these different indigenous communities who were doing the Indigenous Peoples Power Project. And they were, I'd heard the idea of like, we have to do things thinking 7 generations ahead. I'd heard that. But then working with folks, I was like, oh, like actually think through what's going to happen in each of these generations and like what unfolds. I was like, whoa. And so if we use that technology with people, often that helps unveil the values differentials and what is actually, what is the move that works best in the longest view, right? So imagination is an invitation to be like, your idea is great if we only needed to live one more generation or one more decade. It's a fucking brilliant idea. I love it. Everybody should have 5G technology embedded in their brain. Awesome. We'll have a great decade. But we're supposed to have babies from these bodies, and they're supposed to have babies, and they're supposed to have babies, and they're supposed to have babies. And we don't know the impact, right? Like I went and got the vaccine and I was like, this goes against my imaginatory process because I can't foresee enough. And Octavia told me not to do this. And I still want to go see my family. And, so it was like one of those moments where I was like, oh, I can feel myself pulled between the short view, satisfaction, and the long view, responsibility. So I feel like imagination is what helps us dance. And often when I'm with people where I'm like, they're like having this clash, I really ask them to write out, tell me what unfolds. Don't argue with each other. Let your ideas talk to each other as they unfold over time. If your idea works right now, what is the longest perspective that you can see? And I try to be polite with people or kind or inviting, but I'm also like, the horizon is not far enough. The horizon is what we can see right now. And as we move closer to it, it will keep moving further away. There's more territory beyond it. So you have to be able to be like, how can I go beyond the limitation of what I can see right now in this imagining? I think Octavia did that really well. I think that's what she was up to. It's like, oh, like even if I imagine, for Lilith's brood, it's 200 years beyond the apocalypse. So it's beyond the horizon, but she's like, I can still understand what humans would do in these different conditions because of our patterns. Our patterns go back more than 200 years. We can learn, right? And so I'm always trying to engage people, and I'm like, I need you to at least try to look further. Most of us, especially in these the conditions we're in right now, the longest we can actually see is about one electoral cycle, right? So we're like, the way people respond, we're like, Biden won. And I was like, that'll go so fast. What do we have to do during this time to change what happens next time? And how do we start to be thinking 50, 70, 80, 400 years ahead? So, I'm like, there's a way that we can celebrate what we did. But when we look at the conditions, we always have to be like, and this is one step in a very long road. How can we extend our vision? And I said I was going to answer short, and I did not. But it was such a compelling question. It's your fault, really, Damien. I hold you responsible.
Troy.
Hey, everybody. I am actually going to try to come on camera really quickly to ask my question.
Okay.
I am I'm going to say boldly, stealing some time from my employer today to be in this space. So thank you all so much for holding this space for us and for inviting me. My question is, let me get on the camera first. Hold on. Boom, there we go.
Okay, I was like, are you here? And I don't see you. Oh, there you are. Hi, Troy.
I am. Hello, huge fan. I'm definitely more
I know
than a
you.
fan. I'm a stan. So
I was like, you follow me on something.
I follow you on everything.
Okay, I was like, I know your name, Troy.
I'm that person.
Hi.
Also, I'm one of the editors of Trouble the Waters, which is coming out.
Oh, that's soon. What I was like. I know. Yeah. I'd like actually know. Okay.
Yeah. So I have brought this conversation into my home, and this question is actually from my wife, who's a middle school educator, and she's eavesdropping right now, and she wants to know if you have resources or a finger to point in a direction about people who are thinking and talking boldly about kids' satisfaction in schools. Schools is a really fraught space right now. So who in the pleasure space might be centering how we use joy and irresistibility to hold accessible conversations with children about what they want for school?
Ooh, I like this question. What's your wife's name?
Kimberly, would you like to meet her? She is right here.
Hi, Kimberly. That's a great question.
Thank you for answering.
So a couple of things jump to mind that I think will be useful. One is there's a podcast called the Raising Rebels pod that is this Black mom, and she has like her kids are basically kind of driving the podcast, so that she has a bunch of different guests who come on who are in the journey. They talk about consent. They're talking about the culture of what it is to be young in this time. So Raising Rebels pod is excellent. Then there's a book called We Live for the We, that my friend Danny McLean put out last year. I think that has a lot about what does it mean as a parent to be attuned to your child's satisfaction in a variety of different settings, right? We live for the we, yeah? And then there's a book called Parenting for Liberation, which is, there's a whole organization called Parenting for Liberation. She also has a blog. She's amazing, but she put out this beautiful book, and it's telling stories, but it's really stories of like, how am I being in right relationship to what my children are going through, experiencing in the world right now. So those are three things that pop to mind. There's also, I don't know if this quite fits, but there's this beautiful children's book called Julian is a Mermaid, that is about this little child realizing that he's a mermaid and he wants to dress like a mermaid and do this whole beautiful thing.
It's middle school. Everything fits. Everything
great.
That is appropriate and kind to the children's hearts fits.
Yeah, that's great. So it's a children's story, but I think it speaks a lot. And I think what the conversation could be is, at what age did you start to know that there was something else you longed for, and how did the adults around you respond to that, right? How did the adults around you respond to that? How would you have liked them to respond to that? What right now feels like, this is something about me that is different. This is something about me that's unique. This is something that really wants to be expressed. And how do you want the adults around you to respond to that? And I think middle school is a great age to start getting kids to be like, this is when you start to be able to organize your family right? This is as a unit, as a classroom, you start to be able to be like, we want our families to hear this, know this, we want to choose this play to do, and those kind of things. So all of that I think could be really cool, really exciting. And then I think that the parable of the sower, parable of the talents is a little rough for middle school, but I think there's a way to still tell some of the story, because the protagonist is 15 when the story begins. And I think that's important. So I think I often will, when I'm working with younger kids, and I did this with my nibblings, I'll just tell them some of the story, right? It's like, this person is living with her family. They live behind a wall because that's where they can be safe. And then the wall falls down and she has to know everything about how to survive. Now, if that happened to you, what would you do? Right? And right there, kids start to be like, oh, what do I know about survival? What do I need to know about survival? Our middle schoolers need to know, have a go bag. They need to know these things right now. The climate is changing right now, right? They need to know. So I love this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ASU. I really appreciate you all.
Thank you for that excellent question. Thank you all. And thank you, Adrienne, so much for being here. Thank you all for being here. And I want to just do a quick thanks to all of our colleagues, all the other boats in the flotilla that came out to welcome Adrienne's ship across the Zoom Sea, Institute for Humanities Research, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, the Faculty Women of Color Caucus. Thanks to all of them for helping make this event happen. Thank you all for taking a little time out of your day to come and play and imagine with us. So it was great to see you all, old friends, new friends. Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all.